Imagine being sentenced to 400 years in prison for a crime you didn't even commit. Sidney Holmes was convicted of a robbery he did not even commit. Prosecutors in Florida said that he was a driver of two men after they robbed a man and a woman. How was he convicted? Well, a false witness picked him out of a lineup. There was no other DNA evidence. There was nothing else tying him to the crime. At the time, the prosecutors wanted to give him an 825-year prison sentence, but instead got 400. After serving 34 of those 400 years, he was finally exonerated and they finally got it right.
Things that humans were never meant to see. Island of Tifiti. In real life,
Larry Nasser was a doctor for USA Gymnastics and uploaded several videos to his website demonstrating various sports techniques. And while these exercises look professional, many of them were totally made up so Larry could touch girls on the team. And when these allegations were brought forth in 2015, the FBI knew exactly what Larry was doing to child gymnasts. However, several agents helped him cover it up, going as far as falsifying the testimonies of his victims. And while no one at the FBI was punished, in 2017, Larry was arrested and accused of abusing over 300 minors. The following video takes place during his second day in court when a father of 3 victims decides to speak up.
Grant me 5 minutes in a locked room with this demon.
Our legal system.
Well, I'm gonna have to get
Dr. Larry Nasser is given 10 counts of child abuse and is sentenced to 175 years in prison.
These photos were taken in 1988. They're resurfacing on the internet right now, and people are saying that this is one of the most authentic ghost photos ever taken. It was at a dinner party in Austria, and the man to the left decided to take a group photo. The first photo behind me didn't have the flash on, so they decided to take another one. When they got the photos developed, they realized that the first photo they took caught something highly disturbing. Nobody recalls this person being at the dinner party that night. And even stranger, the woman appears to be in the foreground of the other people, meaning she's somehow or another protruding through the table. And you can see when comparing the photos side by side, there's clearly nobody there.
Because of this case, I absolutely fear getting onto public transit. In 2008, Vince Lee beheaded 22-year-old Timothy McLean on a Greyhound bus in Manitoba, Canada. This all happened on July 30th of that year when Vince sat next to Tim on the bus from Winnipeg to Edmonton when Vince pulled out a knife and began repeatedly stabbing Tim. The bus driver and passengers ran out of the bus, called police, and watched as Vince decapitated, mutilated, and cannibalized Tim. When the police arrived, it took 5 hours to negotiate with Vince, and they eventually arrested him when he tried to escape from the bus. The crazy part about this case is that Vince was not held responsible for Tim's murder. He was first charged with second-degree murder, but he pleaded not guilty because he suffered from schizophrenia. Vince said that he heard voices in his head that told him that Tim was evil and he should be executed. The judge ordered Vince to be sent to a psychiatric facility and he was released in 2017. He now lives in Manitoba and has changed his name to Will Lee Baker. And the public was pretty upset about this because they feared that if he decided to stop taking his meds one day, will he attack again?
Why would you lie? And then I realized you're just as naive as I am. Oh, you're so traumatized, it makes me want to cry. You dumb bitch, I loved you, I loved you, I loved you, it's true. I wanted to be you and do what you do.
This is Julia Kingsley. She was the victim of probably one of the worst crimes I've ever heard of. Trigger warning. There are graphic details about this case that may not be suitable for younger viewers. 22 years ago, when Julia was 8 months pregnant, she was violently abducted by this man, 41-year-old Frank Gaines, and his sister, 38-year-old Elizabeth Gaines. For 4 frantic weeks, the police and volunteers from town searched the San Bernardino Mountains in California looking for Julia Kingsley. Then, On October 3rd, 2001, police finally cornered one of the siblings, Elizabeth Gaines, while she was burrowed deep inside an abandoned school. And what's crazy, they found her coddling a newborn baby, which the police believed was Julia Kingsley's 3-week-old daughter. Now, this is where things get very weird, and one of the reasons why nobody from the Valley Lake Police Department is willing to comment on the story. First of all, Julia Kingsley not only worked for the Valley Lake Police Department as a dispatcher, but she was also married to Paul Kingsley, who was the deputy sheriff at the time. The official report is that Officer Kingsley became obsessed while searching for his wife. It would not work on anything else for over 4 months. He also started drinking and became increasingly depressed. But what happened next, you're not going to believe. Like and subscribe for part 2.
What happens when astronauts return to Earth? Frequently fainting.
This house on memories. Take my picture now. Shake it till you see it. And when your fantasy
Forgetting that gravity exists.
legacy, promise me a place. Baby, we built this house.
3 BuzzFeed Unsolved cases had groundbreaking discoveries this year. You maybe remember the story of the Lady of the Dunes. In 1974, a young woman who was out for a walk in the dunes of Cape Cod discovered the body of a woman. She wasn't able to be identified because her killer actually did things to her body so that you wouldn't be able to identify her, like removing her hand so you couldn't get fingerprints. But then this year, through DNA analysis and historical records, she was able to be identified as Ruth Marie Terry. And it turns out her husband at the time, Guy Rockwell Moldovan, was a suspect in the murder of his previous wife and stepdaughter. Then there's the case of the boy in the box, where in 1957, the body of a young boy was found wrapped in a blanket inside of a box in Philadelphia. The identity of the boy remained a mystery until this week, when through DNA analysis, he was identified as Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Police credited advancements in DNA profiling as well as volunteer sleuths who were able to figure out who his potential relatives would have been. Police also say it'll be an uphill battle to determine who is responsible for his death since his parents have since passed. And last we have the Somerton man, whose death in 1948 baffled Australian police. He was an unknown man found laying against the wall on Somerton Beach with nothing on him to identify him. The tags on all of his clothes had been cut, and the autopsy came back as potential poisoning, but his identity has stumped us for decades. That is until July of this year, when he was identified as Charles Webb. It said that a DNA match from a first cousin 3 times removed was what sealed the case.
I bet you didn't know that the youngest person ever executed by the electric chair was found innocent 70 years later. George Stinney Jr. was only 14 years old when he was executed by the electric chair. In 1944, deep in the South, police came for George. He was a child. His parents weren't home. They handcuffed and arrested him. 2 young white girls had been murdered. June Binnicker, age 11, and Mary Emma Thames, age 8. They claimed George and his sister were the last ones to see them alive. They then took George and interrogated him without a lawyer present, without contacting his parents, and they claimed he confessed. But there's zero documentation of a confession ever happening. His sister said they were out tending to the cows when the girls were murdered, so George had an alibi of where he was. The trial only took 2 hours. The jury deliberated for only 10 minutes, and they found George guilty. The lawyer he was assigned didn't fight for George for a second. He didn't try to appeal the sentencing. He called 0 witnesses to the stand. It's like George's fate was already decided before the trial ever even began. George's family couldn't even fight the conviction. They were terrified that everyone else in the family would meet the same fate, so they had to quietly endure this pain for 70 years. When the case was finally reopened and the verdict was thrown out and George was found innocent, his living family members celebrated, but they were still heartbroken because it happened. It was only 84 days after the conviction that George was sent to the electric chair. He was barely 5 feet tall, so he didn't even fit properly in the electric chair. The straps were too loose. He had to sit on books to make him tall enough. When the switch was flipped, his mask fell down, exposing his face. The face of a crying, terrified child.
How does a young woman go from looking like this to looking like this?
This is the disturbing case of Rhoda Dairy. At age 16, Rhoda fell in love with the boy next door. His name was Charles Phoenix. Now, Rhoda came from a poor farming family, while Charles came from a really wealthy family. When the pair started to talk about marriage, Charles's mother was determined to break them up. So one day she approached Rhoda. She told her that if you don't leave my son alone, I'm gonna put a curse on you. No one could have predicted just how traumatic this exchange would be for Rhoda. Like, it would cause her to have a complete mental breakdown. She told her family that she believed she was being haunted by a demon called Old Scratch. Now, her family struggled to contain her outbursts, and very soon they had to commit her. Warning, what happened to Rhoda is very disturbing, and so if you'd rather not know, this is your chance to scroll away. When they committed her to the asylum, Rhoda was placed into this box. She would remain in this contraption for decades. You see those holes in the bottom? Those were designed so that her feces could fall through. Now, reports from the time indicated that Rhonda received food and water, but really no other treatment or care. Conditions were so bad that other vermin, such as rats, had set up their home inside her box. After a couple of decades, she was eventually moved to a new hospital. There she was placed under the care of a doctor named George Zeller. When he discovered what had happened, he vowed that she would never be treated like that again. She was given proper care and was now sleeping in a bed. On October the 9th, 1906, at the age of 71, Rhoda passed away. She was buried on the grounds of the asylum with this tombstone placed on it. It reads, "They built this place of asylum so that no other human would suffer." If you find stories about real-life people interesting, remember to follow 7 Sin Crimes.
This cult inspired the horror movie Orphan, and it is just incredibly messed up. This movie that traumatized me greatly as a child. So, trigger warning, buckle in, this is going to be a wild, wild ride, guys. Klara Mirova was born in Czechoslovakia in 1975, and she always struggled with mental health issues, depression, grandiosity, feeling like God was calling her on some great and grand mission. Her younger sister Katerina also shared in these delusions, and they were obsessed with it. It took over their entire lives. And even though Klara went away to university, she still couldn't escape this idea that God was beckoning her on a quest. Klara ended up being able to live somewhat of a normal life for a short period of time. She was married and had 2 kids, but soon enough, her weird delusions began coming forward and her marriage ended and she was left with her 2 boys. And don't get me wrong, she loved her kids. She spent enough time with them, she nurtured them, but her loneliness was almost too much to take. So she sought after her sister, and her sister moved in with her and her sons. You might be thinking, Kelsey, this doesn't sound that bad. But shit hit the fan. Well, along came this bundle of joy. Barbara, who was a 33-year-old woman that suffered from a rare disease. This disease caused her to take the appearance of a 12-year-old. And boy, did she take advantage of that. She posed as a schoolboy to get out of legal issues and trouble that she found herself in, and just take advantage in general. She befriended Katerina and Klara and basically started validating the delusion going on in their heads. The sisters agreed to join the Grail cult, which is based heavily off of the Holy Grail, and it says that its members are not weighed down by morals or taboos such as incest, cannibalism, and murder. All of that's okay in the Grail cult. The members around the world were led by a mysterious figure called the Doctor, who also supported slavery along with all those other things. So, horrible! Klara ended up shaving off all of her hair, her eyebrows, she dressed in rags and stopped showering, and it was supported by Barbara and her sister Katerina. This is where things get really bad. Barbara convinced Klara that her children weren't normal and they needed to be punished severely. So Klara ordered a cage from a local blacksmith and placed her children inside of the cage. The boys would remain inside that cage for over a year. And this is where the trigger warning comes in. They were brutally tortured, as in they were whipped, they were starved, they were drowned, they were sleeping in their own feces. And I'm sorry to do it, part 2 up right away.
Now that it's summertime, here are 3 of the scariest theme park accidents I've ever heard of. These stories are ordered to get more intense as it goes on, so if the first story is too much for you, then you probably don't want to stick around for the third. On June 21st, 2007, 13-year-old Caitlin Lassiter went to Six Flags of Kentucky. While she was here, she decided to go on the Superman drop ride. This is the kind of ride that lifts you up really high into the air and then it drops you down really fast. However, when their car got to the top, a cable snapped and became undone. This cable became wrapped around Caitlin's throat and feet. She was able to untangle the cord from around her neck, but she wasn't able to get to her feet before the ride dropped, and both of her feet were pulled off. They were able to attach one, but she did end up becoming an amputee. On June 2nd, 2015, the Smiler roller coaster in the UK was having several problems, and one of the test cars got stuck in the middle of the track. However, the employees hadn't communicated with each other that they had added a 5th car, so everyone thought there were 4. So when they saw all 4 cars at the station ready to go, they assumed that the test was done. They then loaded a car full of passengers and sent it down the track, not realizing that a car was already sitting stationary in the middle. The car with passengers inside rear-ended the empty car, resulting in serious injuries. The 2 girls that were sitting in the front of the car had to have their legs amputated. And the horror of this was all made worse because it took emergency services 4 to 5 hours to reach them as everybody was sitting mangled on this roller coaster. The Verrückt water slide was the world's tallest water slide in August 2016, where our 3rd accident happened. This water slide had an extremely steep drop and then a hill, and 3 people would sit in each boat. The owner of the water park had actually self-insured this slide because it was too dangerous for any insurance company to take on. In August 2016, Caleb Schwab went to the water park with his family, and the very first ride he wanted to go on was Verrückt. Caleb sat in the front and was too lightweight to weigh it down, so the ride went airborne. Then everyone watched in horror as the front of the slide impacted the metal safety railing that arched over the top of the slide. He flew out of the raft but hit the netting so hard that he was, It was quick for Caleb, but not for the crowd, as they then had to watch the boat finish the ride as the water began to run red. A guest at the park physically restrained Caleb's mom so she couldn't walk over and see what happened. So the last image she has of her son is excited to go on the ride and stepping into the line.